I usually use my industrial sewing machine, but it sews a lot differently. It's heavenly, actually, because it's very strong and it goes smooth and fast, and the stitches are really even. So if you know you're going to sew a lot, you want to invest in. You got to get at least a 4-foot area. It's a 4-foot long table, like the ones you may have seen in the sewing room. But it's a 4-foot long table and it's got a motor on it. You can get them as low as, I paid $200 for them because we're in LA. There's industrial sewing machines all over the darn place. So I was lucky enough to get one. A lot of people use them at home, and I got one from a woman that was using hers at home, and it wasn't so beat up from a factory. So got a brand new, almost brand new Juki industrial sewing machine for $200. So it's my baby. I love it. But I want to try to replicate what you guys are doing. So I use this little brother sewing machine, and I want to go, because it's a little bit of a struggle on some of the seams where the actual, get this guy. Sorry, where the actual feed dogs feed a little bit differently than on the industrial. The industrial, it's just like, a higher powered motor. So it just sucks fabric in really fast and efficiently. But this one is a little bit more of a sort of an old car, jalopy style. So let's start out with, we'll do that flat felled seam I talked about. I have this fabric here and I want to make a tote bag. This is just a sample. And I want to make a tote bag. You could do this seam a couple of ways. I like to do it. First of all, you're doing it right sides showing. In other words, you can't tell because of this fabric, but this inside is the wrong side of the fabric. And I'm looking at the right side of the fabric facing each other. So that is the first odd thing. You've got to do it right side out. The next thing you have to do is you're going to offset your seam by about a good 1/4 inch. So I've got a good 1/4 inch showing, and then I'm going to sew on a 1/4 inch there. So what you're looking at is the edge of my foot is the 1/4 inch that I have offset, and then the excess out here is another. It ends up being another 1/2 inch showing underneath. So you just got to keep those lined up so that you're lining two things at once. It's a little bit of a busy job for your eyes and your hands. I'm lining up my 1/2 inch seam allowance over there, and I'm lining up my 1/4 inch seam allowance on my foot. So I just, whoops, I want to do this here. I'm going to back stitch. This thread is so beige, I can't see it. Giving it a pull. So all along, I can pin it all the way down, but all along, I'm making sure that I have a very good 1/4 inch hanging out. It's probably a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. Thank you. Coffee delivered, yeah, baby. And just following that offset by a 1/4 inch. And since I don't have this pinned, I just keep checking the bottom to make sure that I'm still lined up. So you want to get this seam right because you got to go on it twice. If you have to take it out, it ain't fun. You also see this kind of a seam on a nice quality men's shirt, especially on the sleeves. You'll see, and then you'll see the body of the shirt. If you roll up your sleeves on your shirt, that's the reason they use that flat felled seam inside of a men's shirt, dress shirt, because when you roll up your sleeves, it still looks really nice. It doesn't, you don't have this, this overlock seam. Overlock seam is this seam right here. This seam finish here where you have this wrapping. When you roll up a men's sleeve shirt, you don't want to see that ugly old overlock seam, even though it's clean and neat. You just want to, that's why you see the clean flat felled seam. So right side is showing. So I pull it open. So now I'm exposing. So this seam that I'm going to roll over the cut part is on the right hand side. It doesn't matter, you could do it lefty if you want, but you just pull this away open, and on the other side you could iron this flat. It would actually be really helpful. So I'm going to do that really quick just to, ooh, almost threw my coffee across the room. So I've gone on the wrong side, and I'm going to lay this fabric that I did the offset, I'm going to lay that toward the seam that I'm folding. I'm just going to give it a quick hit with the iron just so it'll come out nice and flat. It's much flatter now. I know it's a pain, but it's better to turn that iron on and use the iron all the way, all during your sewing time, because you do iron between seams quite often. So the next thing I've done, when I ironed the back, it made this flatter. So I just take and I simply roll that 1/4 inch that I have left over the top of the offset, and I can go down a few inches and pin it if I want, or I can just roll a few inches at a time. Now my second stitching, let me grab these threads. My second stitching is done right along that fold that I'm folding over the first stitch, the first seam allowance. So you can just roll and fold as you go. If the fabric is kind of stretchy, you would want to pin it ahead of time and maybe hit it with iron. But I'm still spreading this with my hands as I go, just to make sure it still stays flat, because that's really important. You want this to be super flat. Again, pulling with 2 hands and tucking and rolling. Make sure to stay right on that folded edge. Don't go toward the first seam. Stay far away from it. It looks better anyway. Have it right along that folded edge. It's up to you whether you want to backstitch. Sometimes I don't on that one. But as you can see, you have a nice flat seam. Come on. You have a nice flat seam, just like on your jeans. It looks much more delicate when you do it on a shirt, but either way, it's the same seam. They do them smaller on the shirt though, but that would be what would be the inside of the bag. And so it's nice and clean and it looks good. So that's your flat felled seam. That's number 1. Another seam that we do is called a French seam. And this French seam would be done on sheer things where you want to have, again, you don't want the overlocking seam finish to show through your fabric, because on a sheer piece, you would have fabric that you could see just right through it. So on that, you would also do right sides together. In other words, this is the right side of the fabric is on the outside on both sides. So that's the same as the flat felt. You're exposing the right side, but this time I'm just doing a 1/4 inch seam. My hand wasn't in the way on that other one. I think it was. So I'm taking a small 1/4 inch seam on this, and totally my seam is going to end up being around 5/8 of an inch, or actually 1/2 an inch. So it's 1/4 inch the first time, back stitch. And you can use this seam on any kind of fabric, thin fabrics. We see it most often on a chiffon and things like that. Chiffon, which is really soft and sheer. So now I have this seam on the outside again. I want to enclose this seam, but I want to do one thing really quick. Even though it's only a 1/4 of an inch, I want to trim it down a little bit, just because I'm going to enclose this in another 1/4 of an inch. And I don't want the 1/4 of an inch to be stacked right on top of the first 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm trimming it down to almost 1/8, not quite, just trimming a little bit off. So it's down. And again, you hit this with the iron. This fabric is very stiff and starchy, so I can just finger press it. And then there's set. Now we're going with right sides together. So that's my right side. So I'm pushing the right sides together, laying the right sides together. And then I'm folding it along the seam that I just made so that I could see those little stitches. And now I'm going to sew again at 1/4 inch. Some of these fabrics, when you're doing a French seam, lay out nice and flat like mine is. Others, they still are so puffy. You got to hit it with the iron right now, but it's okay because this is really behaving. It's nice and stiff. Stiff as in like a starchy stiff. It's still something that you would use for clothing. So all I've done here is I have completely enclosed my stitch, my first row of stitching inside so that you can't see it. And this is why we trimmed it down so that we don't have any hairs or, you know, ravels from the first stitching. We don't have any of those. Now you can see through here a little bit, but what's the beauty of this is when you see through it, you see a nice clean seam. You don't see an overlock stitch. So it's a nice fine finishing effect for a seam. It's a bit more high end than you would see in ordinary clothing. You would probably see most often overlocked finishes. When you spend more money on clothing, you get nicer things inside because the quality of the clothing and the quality of how they make them is why the prices are a little bit higher. So there's one more seam I want to show you that is my favorite. I don't know why. It's a silly thing. This is called a Hong Kong seam finish. Hong Kong like a city. And I might need the iron for that one. This one would be, I'd say 1/2 inch. You would do a 1/2 inch or 3/4. There's no, or 5/8. When you buy a commercial pattern, like a brand name pattern from a store, Joann's, or you buy the brand names on patterns are, excuse me. The brand names on patterns are Simplicity, Butterick, Vogue, and Simplicity, Butterick, Vogue, McCall's. Those are brand names. There's usually 4 of them. You'll also see Quick Sew and one other brand. Those, Berta. Those pattern instructions, the seam allowances that they're asking you to make when you're building something will always be 5/8 of an inch. So that's a little bit more than when we make a pattern. We usually just put a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The industry uses 1/2 inch seam allowances, but just so you know, when you buy a pattern, it's going to be different. It's going to be 5/8. So based on that premise, I'm going to go ahead and make a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Where is it? On this machine. See, when I can't tell on the machine, I just cheat. So you just go to the needle with your ruler. Okay, it's that first square. These little squares are kind of hard to see. That's why I use a sticky note sometimes. This sticky note isn't sticky, but if you want to measure your seam, you just measure your seam and then you use your sticky note as a guide. So 5/8 seam allowance, this is done right sides together. And this is another high-end finish. So you're going to learn a little bit more about bias tape today. So I'm just actually finger pressing this seam open a little bit. I don't want it open all the way yet for very long. So I have my seam and I'm taking some bias tape, and I would use the same color, but I'm just using this color just because it's what I had. and to show you how it looks. So we're inside the garment. We have a piece of bias tape. It ends up being, this is about 1 1/4 inches. That probably should be smaller. The bias tape should be a little bit smaller. So I'm going to cut it down to 1 inch at least. What I'm doing is I'm wrapping each of these 2 seams finishes, these seam allowances, with the bias tape so that it's completely enclosed. So I just want to trim it down a little bit because it's too big. Hope it's not too much. You know what? I think I cut too much. Let me just try it bigger. Because I'm sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, and then I'm going to fold it around. So here's my seam, and here's my bias tape. I'm putting it facing down, which means the right side of my bias tape is facing the right side of my seam. And I'm only grabbing that single seam allowance, just that one edge. And I'm pushing everybody else to the side. So this is what it looks like. I've got just that seam. Right sides together. And then again at a 1/4 inch. You could do less if you want. A 1/4 inch is easy to work with. And considering we had that 5/8 inch seam allowance, it's generous. And this is on a finer garment or finer piece of project that you're working on. So you would use the 5/8 inch seam, and you would use this Hong Kong finish because it's gives it such a nice touch. This is for ravelly fabrics as well, but it also can just be addressing the seam finish. And it definitely has to be bias tape. So it can't be just straight tape. It has to be bias tape. So I've still got just my seam exposed. I'm going to take that bias. I sewed it down. Now I'm going to fold it, and I'm going to finger press it or hit it with the iron. Finger pressing works. And then I'm going to roll it back over. It's kind of like backwards binding. I'm binding it from the front, and I'm not seeing, whereas the other way of binding, we see it. Now I'm going to sew down the crack of this roll that happens between the 2 fabrics. You could hit it with the iron, it would make it nice, but we'll just go with it. So it's kind of like, it's called crack stitching or ditch stitching. It's kind of what you did on that welt pocket. Actually, it's exactly what you did on the welt pocket. In other words, I'm not top stitching over this bias tape. I'm stitching like right next to it so that I'm only catching the 2 pieces of fabric, the single piece of bias tape and the single piece of the seam allowance here. I'll try to keep my hands out of the way. I don't know if you can see really, really close to what I'm doing. So what I'm doing is I'm watching my needle here, and I'm watching it go right to the left of my bias tape. I'm not doing it right on top. It's right next to it, literally on the fold of it, sort of like in the crack, basically, is what we're doing. If we sewed it right on top, it would make the seam a little bit, it would make the bias tape a little bit stiffer, and it won't be as flexible. And we want it to be soft and flexible, because this is not a heavier, you could use this on heavy fabrics, but it's also something you could use on light fabrics. So this is what it looks like when you're done, and you would press it open. You would have this exact same finish on the other side. So that's what it looks like. If this underneath part is too long and it's getting stuck in the fold, yes, you can trim it down a little bit. It's easier to trim it down after than it is to try to gauge if you're doing just the right amount. I probably could have gone 1/8 of an inch less from the beginning. You could experiment with that if you didn't want to have to go back and trim everybody like that. But you just want it to be able to open up. So where you see this kind of a finish very often is, say, for in a garment, you have a jacket that doesn't have lining in it, then you would see these beautiful Hong Kong seam finishes because they have this really exquisite look. I made a coat. Yeah, you can make an unlined coat in California. You don't need the lining. It's already warm enough. So I made this nice overcoat and I did Hong Kong seam finishes on all of it. So when you open up your coat and you're going to take it off in public and because you're warm, then they are slowly blown away by those beautiful seams that you just made. Or a lot of times you'll see like an unlined jacket or an unlined vest, you will see Hong Kong seam finishes. In fine bridal gowns, you will also see this kind of a finish as well. So that is 4 seams. Did we do 4? Oh, the 4th one is just when you sew the edge of your fabric. Like if you don't have an overlock machine, which is also known as a serger, if you had a serger, what you would do is you would sew your seam first, and then you would go over to the serger and you would serge those 2 pieces together. But if you don't have a serger and you still want to do, just ignore the Hong Kong finish there, but you want to finish these ravelly edges, all you have to do in mimicking a serger is go over those ends with a zigzag. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting the edge of my seam allowance right under it separately. I can put the 2 together if I wanted. I'm going to show you just a little one because I already did that Hong Kong seam and that's different. So here's my seam. This is 1/2 inch. If you're making clothing, try on your clothes before you go overlocking all this stuff. Okay, so there's your seam, and now you want to do the seam finish. So you would go to the overlock machine and you would run it along the edge here. So in absence of an overlock machine, you could leave those 2 seams, those 2 seam allowances together, or you could do them separately. It doesn't matter. It's usually okay. We normally just do 2 together like that. All I'm doing now is I'm putting the edge of that seam under the foot and I'm pushing my zigzag button. And I'm going to pull on this thread a little bit first. And I'm just merely grabbing the end of it. I'm not even anywhere near the seam. I'm just grabbing the end of it and covering it with that zigzag. So if you want to go, and that looks really nice. If you want to do that, you could do that instead of overlocking if you don't have an overlock machine. If you're going to sew a lot, you may want to invest in one. You can get a decent one for $400, but maybe you don't want to. You could just use your zigzag and that looks perfectly fine. It came out nice. Any of these little threads that are going to ravel are now stopped dead in their tracks by that zigzag. And it still looks nice inside of your garment. So that's the other seam allowance. So I wanted to show you guys those today, just so you can have something to address. Every time we make a seam, we do want to address the seam allowance that we finished it with. So those all address not only the seam allowance, but also in the case of the French seam, it addressed the seam allowance at the same time that it actually made a seam, and the same with the flat felled. So now do we have questions on those seam finishes? Seams and seam finishes. All of those are very important. Actually, a student last term, and I thought it was a great idea, he explored all of these seams and I gave him points for that. So if you want to take scraps of fabric and explore seam allowances and make me some impressive samples, that would count. I don't remember what I gave him. I think I gave him 25 points. It was worth it because he was curious to see how they worked out, and it was a good learning experience, and then got some points. So you could certainly do that. So I have it in the recording, and I will post the recordings as soon as I can. I'm having trouble getting those recordings posted, but I'll try to get them all as soon as I can, especially these things where you might want to go back and review. So that's it. If you want to ask questions individually about your future projects, I can do that now. I'll just ask you individually and ask if you want to go in breakout rooms or just ask me. And all I wanted to know is basically where you're at in your projects right now, but also what you're planning on doing, just so that you can keep yourself on a good track, or if you need advice on how to begin to work on your project. Maybe some of you have already worked on your projects. If you're having trouble coming up with a project, don't worry, there's Pinterest. There's a lot of stuff on Pinterest that might pique your interest. That's what that is, Pinterest interest. The thing about Pinterest is, if, say, for example, you don't really know what you want to do for a project, go on Pinterest and find some simple patterns. I usually type in things like free wallet patterns or passbook covers or things like that. And then you'll get a bunch of free patterns, and then you'll get a bunch that they want you to pay for them. I don't necessarily think you need to pay for a pattern right now, but if you do, that's totally fine. A lot of those are made by individual artisans, and they have directions that come with them, so that might be helpful. Even the free ones do have directions as well. You'll either get a PDF or a video. And so if you're type in something specific, so that you can get a collection of that idea. Say, for example, t-shirts. I don't know if you're ready to make a t-shirt, because t-shirt is stretch knit and it has all kinds of different handling things that you need to worry about. Easy things like wallets, tote bags. You could do like a throw pillow for decorative throw pillow. Those are very easy to make. And all of those things, if you're not sure exactly what you want to do for a project, find something and just work on it. And believe me, while you're sewing, you're going to start getting very inspired. Or just being on Pinterest, you'll have to pull yourself off like I do. I love Pinterest because it's really got a lot of information on it. So don't let not knowing what to do stop you. Make even a tote bag while you're trying to figure out what else you're going to make. So just keep sewing. So does anybody have questions or need to talk about what they might want to work on for their project?
I actually had one question about bias tape. So
Okay.
what's different about bias tape than the fabric that we're using? If like we wanted to use, is it possible to use the same fabric as a bias tape, or is there something special about it?
No, I do the same all the time. If you're using the same fabric, like for example, this fabric is kind of thick, so I'm not sure I'd want bias tape out of that, although you could. But I just cut. I thought I talked to you guys about bias tape last week. Let me show you. I'll cut a piece really quick. Bias tape is very helpful because we use it for many different things. So what I've done is I just take a square of fabric, usually like when I'm done cutting everything else, and then I'll cut bias tape. Don't cut it with brand new fabric if you haven't cut your shirt out yet. Make sure you save that for last. Most of the time I am able to cut long strips when I'm doing bias tape so that I can sew them together. But since you're cutting it on the bias, you're getting a little bit of mileage out of it. So for example, let me see if I can go up here. I'll show you how to cut bias tape. There we go. So this is a pretty big piece of fabric because it's folded. So the fastest way to get the bias, you have a square fabric. This is somewhat square. And you don't have to have a huge piece, but you have to have a decent piece because you want to make strips. So just to fold it on the bias, you just fold it like the triangle down, and you just look and see if the weave is lining up. So then I know that this weave is straight and this weave is straight. So then I know I'm on a good bias. So then all I do with that, if you don't have a rolling cutter, is you just cut it in half. on the bias. Here comes my scissors, there they are. So now you could do, if you, I'm going to do this without a rolling cutter since probably some of you don't have one. So this is my 2-inch grid, but I want to just make it 1 1/4 inches. 1 1/4 inches for bias tape seems to be pretty versatile. I can use that width for a ton of stuff. Depending on what you're making, you might want to make it a little thinner, but most often you may want to make it thicker if you're wrapping something, and because some garments or some items you show the tape and it becomes trim after you've put it on. So you would make it thicker so that you could have a decent looking trim. So you could like trim the top of your hem, the top of your tote bag by using this bias. So I've marked it at 1 1/4 inches, and that's my width. You could pin, if you pin it, you would pin right on the bias, because you want to keep this very straight. And then I'm just going to cut my line. It's easier just to draw the line with pencil, and unless you're going to use the rolling cutter. And then we'll talk about ways to use bias tape, because you do use this a lot. And you can buy this in the store ready-made. You get like 3 yards for a dumb amount of money. It's not like it's super expensive, but I don't remember buying bias tape for many years. I just make my own. There's good reasons to make your own, yes, to have the same exact fabric that you're using, but also maybe you want to use a contrasting fabric. Maybe you want, I like to do bias with stripes because that gives it a really cool look. So even though this fabric is, there we go. It's not printed, so it's easy to get them mixed up, but it won't matter because either one is the right side. But when you sew your pieces of bias together, when you've cut your square, you automatically have these pointed edges. So you want to oppose those edges when you sew it together. If you can see white on white here. Hit that with the iron. So there's the right side of my first white piece, and then there's the other side. So I'm opposing them, and that when I oppose them like that to get a 1/4 inch seam allowance, I get this little notched open area here. When I line them up. You don't want to line them up down where the corner is touching the top there. You want to cross it so that you're creating this little V shape here. That gives you a clean seam allowance, and this is where your tape needs to line up. So I'm going to put that carefully right at the needle. And I'm going to head straight down for this other little notch there. But I do want to backstitch because I use my tape and I do yank a lot on it, yank around on it. So, oh, don't zigzag it. So just going straight down, and then I do backstitch. I'm going to grab those threads so I can pull it a little bit. As it gets delicate, excuse me. And then all I did was head to that other little V-shaped thing and backstitch there. If I had a long piece I was making, this is my right side would be underneath. So then I would flip it over and I would add another piece and just keep on sewing until I had a really long piece of bias tape. So you get a pretty good piece out of those diagonal cuts. And the reason we want the diagonal cut is, well, it's bias, is that we want it to be flexible so that we can do many, many things with it. The last thing when you're making it together like this, you want to open it up and hit it with the iron. If it's a soft, like this is a decent woven fabric, it's okay to just scratch it with your fingernail, and that made it stay open. So the reason we do the seams at that angle is because when you're using the tape, you can see that the seams don't line up. You don't want bulk, but you not only have zero bulk when you sew this together, but then by the time you use it and maybe wrap it around something, the seam almost disappears. The only thing that shows is that this has base thread, but with white thread, you would barely see that edge. So that's why we like to use bias tape for tons and tons of stuff. say you made a just a shirt, and you know, like a sleeveless shirt, you would put the tape around the edges. I'll show you what I mean by that. I'll make a curve. There's tons of ways to use bias tape. And what I showed you last week is you could use it for binding. And that's what I use it most often for, is binding. But if I was going around a sleeve, I have this curve of the sleeve. In fact, I could make it a little bit more curvy. Let me get something that's going to show better. Okay, so here I have a severe curve. And I either want to bind it or just put a bias binding on it. This is to finish off, say, an armhole. Mm-hmm. So I can either do it from the top or from the bottom with the bias tape. But the point of the bias tape at this point is for it to be flexible. So the bias will flex around that curve. So I'm going to put that at 1/4 inch. I can't see around my phone. I'm just going to sew it straight. I can't see my foot. Grab those 2 threads, back stitch. Okay, so when you're putting bias on something, the beauty of bias is that it's going to do that curve. You can see it puffing up a little bit here, but it will flatten out. You just use your fingers a lot because the bias has the ability to contract while you're sewing. You don't necessarily pull it and stretch it yet. This side, I'm actually compressing it a little bit so I can make it around the curve. And for me, sometimes it's easier to put the bias tape underneath because then the machine flattens the tape out for me. But with this way, I'm just using my fingers and I'm pulling it. I want to compress it here on the inside, but here I'm kind of stretching it a little bit so I can make that curve. And it doesn't matter, I'm not getting it out of whack. I'm just manipulating it to conform, forcing it to conform. So I'm maintaining, what's important about what the job of the bias is doing is to maintain the curve that I already have, yet still cover it. So this is sort of like, it can be like the Hong Kong seam that we just did. So say this was a sleeve, an armhole. If you wanted to make it so that it just is a trim, in other words, the bias was just design and it would show like that, you would have cut your garment out on the stitching line so that this raw edge here was your stitching line. In other words, you're going to cut it all away and only expose your stitching line. So that's kind of tricky to remember or to actually use in theory. But another way to do this is say this is the same sleeve, it's the same armhole. If I want to hide the bias tape completely, I would go inside and I would hit it with the iron. I would just go ahead and iron this. I have to iron it because it's going to stick out funny. You could have ironed this ahead of time, which is when you buy bias tape, it comes pre-folded. But all I'm doing is I'm ironing this little tiny edge at 1/4. And I'm only hitting the bias tape at 1/4 edge. It would have been easier to do it while it was straight and not connected to this garment, but either way is correct. Sometimes I don't think of it ahead of time and I just throw it on there and I go, oh, I should have pressed it. But you know, you could always take a little bit longer and be more tedious by pressing it after, or you could just finger press it as well, which sometimes works out just fine. So from here, I want to go completely inside. So I'm folding the pressed piece that I just put in, that I just folded. completely to the inside so that on the right side it doesn't show.
Oh, cool.
So that's another way to enclose. And the thing about bias is this is curvy. So I need to pull on the bias to get it to follow that curve, because now I'm asking it to be more, a little bit larger than it was. And I would pin this along the way. So that I would make sure, and then I would probably press it too, to make sure that this is nice and flat. So there's two ways to finish this. This always gets so complicated. And I feel like I want to show you something easy that you'll be able to understand, but it can get a little bit more complicated. So here's two ways to do this. You would just sew it flat right along this seam here, right along the folded edge, but then you would have a stitching line showing. You didn't want the stitching line to show. A lot of times we just want a clean edge like that. You just would sew this by hand. You're not slip stitching all the way. You're slip stitching through the bias tape. Like you would put your needle here in the bias tape along that fold. But then when you grab your fabric, you would just grab a little prick of fabric, like maybe 2 or 3 threads of fabric. I can't even see that. So you're slipping your stitch through the bias tape, but then you're just grabbing one tiny little piece of fabric. So the worst case scenario would be you would see little teeny dots of thread, barely, depending on, this fabric, you could hide those hand stitching and it would come out, that it doesn't show at all. Now, the reason that I said that this tends, when I explain things, they tend to get a little complicated. Say, for example, I was going to use this hidden version of an armhole, and I wanted to slip stitch it so that it doesn't show. Before I go all pinning it down, I would do one more thing. And this is something that if you're doing garments or you're doing a facing on a bag, this is something that you would come across maybe often, and it's called understitching. So this is something that you'll learn, or you'll come across it and you go, oh yeah, I remember understitching. So what understitching does is I have this bias tape piece, and then I got my seam allowance here. What I want to do, and it's called, what's called the understitching, is I want to stitch that together. And that's going to give me a really good flat look. So I push the seam allowance over to the right, and I cover, put my finger on the bias tape and I flatten it out. And I go about 1/8 of an inch away from that edge. So I'm going to follow on my foot, about halfway of my foot along this folded edge of bias tape. So it's just what I'm doing. Come on. What I'm doing is I'm sewing that seam allowance actually right onto the bias tape, but I got to pull it nice and flat as I go. I'm just doing a scant 1/8 inch away. I'm pulling it really flat and just understitching it. So you'll see this in clothing. It will also work in the facing of like a bag. So what this has done, and I'll show you the reason I didn't finish it, is to compare. I'm going to hit it with the iron again. So I rolled my part and I hit it with the iron. Now when I fold this, I'm seeing a little bit of my outer fabric peek out of my bias tape. And that's actually what you want. It is the reason that we're doing the understitching, is because we want this peeking out. It won't lay flat anymore next to each other because we've changed that. So I'm going to hit it with the iron. And then I'm going to go and show you the part that I didn't do that with and hit that with the iron. And I'll show you the difference. A lot of patterns, especially the older ones, they don't tell you to understitch. They just had you do this second part that I'm doing, where I'm folding it and I'm matching the two edges so that I have the seam is showing. this, so the seam is just flat, and I iron that. Well, what happens, especially if it's a big neckline or, you know, something that is larger than just a small armhole, over time, it just keeps, it seems like it wants to peek out. See, I'm getting little peekies of the bias tape, and it doesn't always stay rolled. It's not a really good flat roll. But the bias tape one, where I did the understitching, this, it almost folds itself automatically. It folds in and it stays clean. I won't have any peekies. See how that's peeking out?
Yeah.
So this is another one of those steps that you would take. If you didn't take the step, it's totally fine. But this is another one of those steps you would take to make a nice finished edge on your garment. And again, if you end up needing to take this out, you're going to be kind of pissed. You're like, oh God, I want to take, because it's a pain. Now to take this bias tape off, say you wanted to make your sleeve armhole bigger, you have to take the whole thing apart, and that's a royal pain. So just remember to try things on, or, you know, imagine them finished, even though they're partially finished. Go to that extra step and seeing, is this really what I want, before you start doing all the understitching. So that's one of the ways to finish using bias. If you are having a skirt or a pair of pants and you didn't have much of a hem, usually we just overlock the edge and we fold it and we make a hem. Now we're launching into hemming. This is all good. This is all good. So say I wanted to hem this edge here. This is far too ravelly. I don't, even if it wasn't ravelly, you can't just fold it and stitch a hem. This has to be addressed because it's going to fall apart. Even though you stitched it down, the fabric will come out and your hem will just unhem itself, literally. So when you're making a hem, you've got to do a double fold. So I'm going to do the first fold. And this would be is on a tote bag, on a pair of jeans, anything. Your hem is different widths, but the first part of your hem is 1/4 of an inch. And after that, you can make it any size you want. But you just have to have at least one fold to make a hem. So say this is the top of a tote bag. I don't want a skinny hem at the top of a tote bag. That's right there would be for jeans or a pant, or you could even a skirt. But on a tote bag, you want it to be a little beefier, have a little bit more structure, and it has a nice finished look when you fold it another inch. So I've added 1 1/4 inch to my pattern when I made my tote bag. So now I've got my 1/4 inch roll, then I measure 1 inch, and then I hem along this folded edge here. So that gives me a very nice thick hem. And then later I can go and I sew my straps from the inside right on top of that. So I don't know if that, oh, the reason I went into that is because, say, for example, you have a pant and there's no room to make a hem. You only have 1/4 of an inch, that's it, you don't have any more. You can take bias tape and sew it and make the hem with that. Or you can take straight fabric and make it thicker and make a nice facing. It's called a facing when you have it. It's not bias, it's facing. And you would sew that on and then flip it over so that your hem would look like that. You'd have tape on your hem instead of the hem itself. Either way is correct. So you got lots of good information. Any other questions?
No, thank you.
Yeah, I always give you guys the long answer, because there's all these caveats. That's fine. I like this fabric, but I washed it and it got very snaggy. So I probably have to pull the red out. So who has projects that they need to talk about? Are you okay just going on Pinterest or sketching your own or going to your favorite website? There's no, you're not really copying fashion. You're just making another one because there's nothing new in fashion. And it's, there's nothing, you may have, you actually could think of something that hasn't been done yet, but most of the time we're just redoing and redesigning. And there's no copyright in, like, say, a pair of jeans. Levi's never owned a copyright, because then we'd all be wearing the same pants. We'd actually all be wearing, you know, primitive clothing if there was patents on them. So we, as long as you're not copying somebody's pattern and selling it, once you make something, it pretty much becomes your own. So there's no strict laws. So that's why most of the designs you see is really just a repeat of what we already have out there, because what we have out there, it works. And, you know, there's only so many ways you can design a pant, frankly. So I'll let you work. And if you guys are interested, at the end of class, I can show you how to make that little zipper pouch that's lined. You had the zipper pouch last week, right?
Mhm.
So if you want to know how to make a zipper pouch lined, I can show you that. Or you can just go ahead and make a couple zipper pouches, and I can show you another time, another week, because it's a little bit different. And I actually showed it yesterday in my Thursday class, and I recorded it. So I can put the recording up on how to do it. So it's up to you.
I
So,
have a few questions on my project.
okay. Do you want to just ask now, or go in the breakout room?
Can we do it in a breakout room?
Yeah. Who is that, Tony?
Alex.
Oh, okay. I only see like 3 people on the video. Okay, I got to remember how to do breakout room. I'll stop recording.